So, Joanna, is the unemployed life as relaxing as it looks? Or do you just enjoy watching the rest of us actually contribute to society? Evan Carter leaned back in his mahogany chair, swirling a glass of vintage Cabernet, with a smirk that felt like a slap. My father let out a dry, appreciative chuckle, nodding as if Evan had just delivered a brilliant keynote speech instead of a cheap insult at my expense. My mother didn't even look up from her plate. Her silence allowed confirmation that she agreed I was the primary embarrassment of this family. The clinking of silver against fine china felt like a countdown in the suffocating air of my parents' dining room. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, that familiar stinging sensation of being the black sheep in a room full of people who valued gold over blood. My sister Sarah adjusted her 3-carat diamond engagement ring under the glow of the chandelier, giving me a look of feigned pity that felt sharper than the steak knife in her hand. Everyone laughed a synchronized sound that echoed off the high ceilings of a house that had always felt more like a museum of my failures than a home. Before I tell you how I turned that arrogant smirk into a mask of pure terror, I want to invite you to join my journey. Please take a moment to subscribe and join our community so you never miss a chapter of this story. I'm also truly curious to know what time it is for you right now and which city or state you are watching from. I read every single one of your comments, and they mean the world to me. I took a slow, deliberate sip of water, my eyes tracking the way Evan adjusted his French cuffs. It was a nervous tick, a tiny glitch in his performance that didn't match his booming, confident voice. For months, this man had been the center of my family's universe, the golden boy who was going to save my father's legacy and give my sister the life of a socialite. They adored him because he was everything they wanted me to be. Loud, wealthy, and obsessed with the optics of success. Evan began to boast again, his voice filling the room with high-level buzzwords like asynchronous scalability and derivative hedging. He spoke about his exclusive partnership with a Silicon Valley firm as if he were the one holding the keys to the kingdom. To my parents and Sarah, he sounded like a financial genius destined for the cover of a magazine. To me, he sounded like a man who had spent 30 minutes skimming a Wikipedia summary of finance for beginners. The problem for Evan was that he didn't know who I really was. To this family, I was the 24-year-old dropout who couldn't hold down a traditional 9-to-5. They didn't know about the tech consulting firm I had built and sold under a pseudonym before I even finished my degree. They didn't know that my sabbatical wasn't because I was lazy, but because I was waiting for my non-compete clause to expire while I sat on a net worth that could buy this entire neighborhood 10 times over. I had kept my success a secret because I wanted to see if they would ever love me for something other than a balance sheet. Tonight, I got my answer. Evan made a fatal mistake when he mentioned a specific project lead at a firm called Apex Core. He claimed he had spent the afternoon on a private conference call with the chief operating officer discussing a merger that would supposedly net my father a 20% return on his investment. My heart stopped for a half second. I knew that chief operating officer personally. In fact, I had been the one who hired him 3 years ago. And I knew for a fact that Apex Core didn't have a merger on the table, nor did they have any record of an Evan Carter on their payroll. I didn't call him out right then. I didn't raise my voice or throw my water in his face. I simply watched him letting the silence between his sentences stretch out just long enough to see the sweat beads forming at his hairline. I smiled a thin, dangerous smile that my mother mistook for a sign of submission. I even asked him to tell us more about the specific technical architecture of the merger, watching him scramble to piece together more nonsense, while my father beamed with pride at his future son-in-law. The dinner continued for another hour, a grueling marathon of vanity, where Evan was the star and I was the punchline. He told stories about private jets and gala events, each one more elaborate than the last. My sister hung on every word, her eyes shining with the reflected glory of a man she barely knew. They were all participating in a play, and I was the only one in the audience who could see the stage hands frantically moving the cardboard props. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had shifted from simple mockery to a kind of celebratory dismissal. My father announced that he had already moved $200,000 into Evan's new venture, calling it a gift for the couple's future. Evan accepted the news with a humble nod, though his fingers gripped his wine glass a little too tightly. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't just about a guy being a jerk anymore. This was a predatory strike against my own father's retirement fund. I excused myself early, claiming I had an early morning, which only prompted one last jab from Evan about how hard it must be to wake up for a day of doing nothing. I didn't respond. I walked out to my car, the cool evening air of the Illinois suburbs hitting my face. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the lit windows of the house. I realized then that my family didn't just value image over truth, they were addicted to it. They would rather be lied to by a man in a tailored suit than hear the truth from a daughter in a hoodie. I drove back to my apartment in downtown Chicago, my mind racing through the thousands of lines of code and the deep network of professional contacts I had spent years building. The arrogance Evan had displayed wasn't just an insult, it was a map. He had given me every piece of information I needed to dismantle him. He thought he was the predator in a house of sheep, but he had no idea he was dealing with the one person who knew exactly how to track him. The first thing I did when I got home was kick off my shoes and head straight for my office. I pulled up my dual monitor setup, the familiar blue glow of the screens reflecting in my eyes. I didn't feel tired anymore. I felt a cold, clinical resolve. I reached out to a man named Marcus, an old contact of mine who specialized in SEC compliance and private equity fraud. I didn't give him the full story yet. I just gave him a name and a company. Within 20 minutes, my inbox pinged. Marcus had found the first red flag. Apex Corp was a real company, but the entity Evan was using to collect my father's money was a shell corporation registered in Delaware with a mailing address that led to a shared mailbox in a strip mall. There was no office, no staff, and certainly no merger. Evan Carter was a ghost, a beautifully dressed specter who had haunted my family's dining room and walked away with a six-figure check. I spent the rest of the night digging deeper, my fingers flying across the keys as I bypassed the superficial layers of Evan's digital life. I found the forum posts where he had hunted for victims before the small claims court filings that had been settled quietly to avoid public scandal, and the trail of broken promises he had left across 3 different states. Every time I uncovered a new lie, I felt a strange mix of fury and clarity. He had been playing a long game, and my sister's heart was just another piece on his board. I looked at the framed photo on my desk of me and Sarah when we were kids, before the weight of our parents' expectations had driven a wedge between us. She looked so happy, so unprotected. I knew that if I just told her, she would scream at me. She would call me a liar and tell me I was trying to ruin her happiness because I had none of my own. My parents would back her up protecting the lie because the truth was too humiliating to bear. To save them, I had to let the lie grow until it was too big to ignore. I had to let the wedding proceed. I began to compile a dossier, a digital mountain of evidence that was as undeniable as gravity. I didn't just want to stop him. I wanted to ensure he could never do this to anyone else again. I tracked the $200,000 my father had sent, watching as it moved through a series of offshore accounts before landing in a high-stakes gambling portal. The man wasn't just a fraud, he was a desperate one. And desperate men always make mistakes when they think they've already won. I barely slept that week. I maintained a perfect silence even when Sarah texted me photos of her $1,000 bridal shoes, or when my mother called to remind me to wear something that didn't look like I found it in a dumpster. I played my role to perfection. I was the quiet, brooding sister who stayed out of the way. I attended the dress fittings, I listened to the flower arrangements, and I watched as Evan grew bolder with every passing day, convinced that he had successfully buried me under his mountain of bullshit. The wedding rehearsal was set for a prestigious vineyard in the heart of the Midwest, a place where the vines were as manicured as the guests. It was the kind of setting my parents lived for a display of wealth and taste that signaled to the world that the Miles family had finally arrived. Evan was in his element holding court with my father's business associates, promising them insider access to his next big fund. I stood in the shadows of the tasting room, a glass of sparkling cider in my hand, watching him spin his web. He caught my eye once and raised his glass a mocking salute that said he knew I couldn't stop him. He thought my silence was weakness. He thought my presence was a white flag. He had no idea that I was just waiting for the cameras to be in position. He didn't realize that the more he boasted, the deeper the hole he was digging for himself. I had already coordinated with the venue's audiovisual technician, a young guy who had been treated like dirt by Evan during the setup. We had a plan for the tribute video that was supposed to play during the reception. My father approached me during the rehearsal dinner, his face flushed with wine and pride. He put a hand on my shoulder, but it didn't feel like a gesture of affection. It felt like he was trying to steady himself. He told me that I should try to be more like Evan, that I should find some of that fire and ambition. He said that once the wedding was over, he was going to invest the rest of my college fund, the money I had never used, into Evan's firm. He thought he was doing me a favor, securing my future through the man who was currently robbing him blind. I looked my father in the eyes, seeing the man who had raised me and the man who had dismissed me in the same breath. I wanted to tell him right then. I wanted to shake him and show him the bank transfers on my phone, but I knew the psychology of a man like him. If I told him now, he would find a way to justify it. He would tell himself I was mistaken or that Evan had a logical explanation. For the truth to stick, it had to be public. It had to be a spectacle that no amount of image crafting could fix. I spent the night before the wedding in a hotel room near the vineyard. My laptop opened, my eyes burning from the glow of the screen. Marcus had sent over the final piece of the puzzle, a recorded deposition from a woman in Ohio who had lost her entire life savings to a man matching Evan's description and fingerprints 2 years ago. The case had gone cold because he had vanished before the warrant could be served. I had the warrant number, I had the case file, and I had a live feed to a private investigator who was sitting in the vineyard parking lot waiting for my signal. The morning of the wedding was a whirlwind of white silk and frantic bridesmaids. I watched my sister get ready, her face a mask of bridal perfection, hiding the tremors in her hands. She was terrified, but she didn't know why. She thought it was just nerves, the weight of the commitment. She didn't realize her intuition was trying to scream over the noise of the wedding planner. I wanted to hug her, but when I stepped into the room, she just asked me to go find her missing earring. I was still the errand girl, the one who didn't matter. As the guests began to take their seats in the rows of white chairs overlooking the valley, I felt a strange sense of calm. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume. I took my seat in the front row, the folder of documents tucked into the silk lining of my clutch. It felt heavy, like a weapon. I watched as Evan took his place at the altar, looking every bit the part of the successful, loving husband. He adjusted his tie and checked his reflection in the polished surface of a nearby silver urn, his vanity unshakable even at the edge of the abyss. The music started that slow, rhythmic march that signaled the beginning of the end. My father led Sarah down the aisle, his chest puffed out, his eyes watery with the kind of emotion that only comes when you think you've finally won the game of life. He handed her hand to Evan and the ceremony began. The minister spoke about trust, about building a house on a rock, about the sacred bond of honesty. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud at the irony. Every word was a condemnation of the man standing 5 feet away from me. When the minister asked if anyone had any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, the silence was absolute. I didn't stand up. I didn't make a scene. That wasn't the plan. The plan was to let them sign the license. I wanted Evan to be legally bound to the family before I pulled the rug out. I wanted the stakes to be as high as possible. I watched them exchange rings, watched them kiss, and watched as the crowd erupted into applause for a union built on a foundation of theft. The reception was held in a massive glass-walled tent, the tables draped in gold and ivory. The wine flowed like water, and the laughter was loud and brittle. Evan was moving from table to table, already collecting more commitments from my father's friends. He was at the peak of his power, the golden child who could do no wrong. I waited until the first course was cleared, until the mood was at its most celebratory. My father stood up to give his toast, his voice booming through the speakers. He talked about how he had always worried about his daughters, but that Evan had given him the peace of mind he had been searching for. He talked about legacy and the future. And then he invited me up to say a few words, his tone carrying that familiar hint of a challenge, as if he were daring me to say something that wasn't a disappointment. I stood up, smoothing my dress, and walked toward the podium. I didn't look at my mother's worried face or my sister's annoyed expression. I looked directly at Evan. The drive back to the city was the only time I felt I could truly breathe. As the suburban sprawl of my parents' neighborhood faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the jagged iron gray skyline of Chicago, the tightness in my chest began to loosen. My apartment was a minimalist loft in a converted warehouse downtown, a space defined by exposed brick-high ceilings and an absolute lack of the floral-patterned wallpaper that seemed to suffocate my mother's house. I stepped inside and didn't bother turning on the lights. The ambient glow of the city, the humming street lamps, and the neon pulses of the Loop provided all the illumination I needed. I headed straight for my office, a room that my family assumed was filled with half-finished puzzles and job application rejection letters. In reality, it was the cockpit of my real life. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and hit the power button on my custom-built tower. Two 32-inch curved monitors flickered to life, bathing the room in a cool electric blue light. This was my sanctuary. This was where I had built my first tech consulting firm, a niche agency I had operated under the name Sterling Analytics, while my parents were busy telling their friends I was just going through a phase. I had sold that firm 18 months ago to a major conglomerate for $5 million. After taxes and a few smart investments, I was sitting on enough capital to never work another day in my life. But I had signed a strict 2-year non-compete clause that kept me on the sidelines. To my father, a man who measured worth, by the hours you spent sitting in an office chair you didn't own, I was a failure. To me, I was a woman who had bought her own freedom before her 25th birthday. I pulled up a secure messaging terminal and typed out a message to Marcus. Marcus was a man I'd met during a high-stakes audit 3 years prior. He was a veteran of the Securities and Exchange Commission with a memory like a steel trap and a deep-seated hatred for the kind of men who wore $3,000 suits but couldn't explain their own balance sheets. I didn't give him the emotional context. I didn't mention the dinner or the way Evan had looked at me. I simply provided the name Evan Carter and the entity he had mentioned, Apex Core. I spent the next 3 hours performing my own preliminary sweep. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clicking the only sound in the quiet loft. If Evan was the genius he claimed to be, there would be a digital footprint. There would be white papers, keynote transcripts from industry conferences, or at the very least a verified LinkedIn profile with a network of actual humans. But as I dug deeper, the desert became apparent. Evan Carter existed only in the present tense. His past was a series of dead links and deleted profiles. My phone vibrated on the desk. It was a text from Sarah. She had sent a high-resolution photo of a floral arrangement featuring white peonies and silver dollar eucalyptus. Beneath the photo, she wrote that Evan thought the peonies were too traditional and wanted to switch to white orchids, which would cost an extra $4,000. She asked if I thought the orchids were too much. I stared at the screen, the absurdity of the request hitting me like a physical weight. My sister was worrying about the species of a flower while she was walking hand in hand toward a financial cliff. I didn't reply. A notification pinged on my monitor. Marcus had sent over a preliminary file. I opened the encrypted attachment and began to scroll. The first thing that hit me was the registration for Apex Core. It wasn't a venture capital firm or a private equity group. It was a limited liability company registered in Delaware just 6 months ago. The registered agent was a service that provided thousands of shell companies with a legal shield for a few $100s a year. The physical address listed on the internal filings wasn't a glass tower in Palo Alto. It was a private mailbox at a strip mall in a sleepy suburb of Indianapolis. The deeper the report went, the more the red flags began to bleed into each other. Evan Carter had no record of employment at any of the firms he had listed on the bio he'd given my father. Even more chilling was the list of private investments Marcus had uncovered through a back-channel credit report. There were no institutional backers, no banks, no reputable investors. Instead, there were a dozen small deposits ranging from $10,000 to $50,000, all from individuals over the age of 65. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme designed to prey on the trust of people who had more retirement savings than technological literacy. I leaned back, my eyes burning as I stared at the screen. Evan wasn't a high-flying executive. He was a bottom feeder who had hit the jackpot when he met my sister. He had found a family so obsessed with the appearance of success that they had stopped asking for proof. I thought about the $200,000 my father had mentioned at dinner. That money wasn't being invested in a Silicon Valley merger. It was being used to pay for Sarah's 3-carat ring, the vineyard rental, and Evan's vintage Cabernet. My father was literally financing his own daughter's marriage to a thief. I pulled up a private aviation database I'd used during my consulting days. Evan had boasted about a business trip to San Francisco last week to meet with a group of angel investors. I cross-referenced his name with the flight manifests for every commercial and private flight out of O'Hare and Midway for those 3 days. Nothing. I checked the license plate recognition data for the tollways near his apartment. His car had never left the state. While my family thought he was closing deals in a boardroom on the West Coast, he was likely sitting in a mid-range hotel room 10 miles away, probably laughing at how easy it was to fool them. The clock on my taskbar shifted to 3 o'clock in the morning. The city outside was at its quietest, the blue light of my monitors casting long, distorted shadows against the brick walls. I felt a cold, clinical resolve settling into my bones. This wasn't just about my wounded pride anymore. This was a tactical necessity. If I walked into my father's house tomorrow and showed him these files, he would find a way to discredit me. He would say I was jealous or that I had faked the documents because I couldn't stand to see someone else succeed. He would protect Evan because protecting Evan was the only way to protect his own ego. I began to organize the data into a comprehensive dossier. I created a folder and titled it The Gift. I included the shell company filings, the mailbox address photos, the empty flight manifests, and the list of disgruntled elderly investors who had already filed complaints in other jurisdictions. I added a screenshot of the gambling portal transactions Marcus had flagged, the ones showing that a large portion of the investment funds were being funneled into high-stakes offshore poker accounts. Every piece of evidence was a nail in the coffin of the man my family adored. I looked at the invitation sitting on my desk, the gold-embossed lettering mocking me. The wedding was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks of watching them spend money they didn't have to impress people who didn't care. I realized then that the only way to save my sister was to let the illusion reach its absolute peak. For the truth to have the impact required to shatter my father's stubbornness, it had to be delivered at the moment when the mask was most beautiful. I had to wait until the cameras were rolling and the world was watching. I spent the next hour coordinating with Marcus. I needed more than just files. I needed a timeline of the money. I wanted to see exactly when my father's $200,000 hit Evan's account and exactly where it went. I wanted to see the receipts for the wedding venue and the designer dress. I wanted to prove that the entire celebration was a monument built with stolen bricks. As I worked, the anger that had been simmering in me since dinner began to transform into something sharper and more useful. It became a plan. I thought about the way Evan had smirked when he asked if I was still unemployed. He had thought he was the smartest person in the room because he was the only one lying. He didn't realize that being the person who listens is far more dangerous than being the person who talks. He didn't know that while he was performing for my father, I was auditing him. I closed my laptop, the silence of the loft returning as the blue glow faded. I didn't go to sleep. I stood by the window watching the first hints of dawn begin to touch the tops of the skyscrapers, the cold light of the morning promising a clarity that my family wasn't ready for. I reached for my phone and finally replied to Sarah's text about the flowers. I typed out a short, simple message telling her that she should definitely go with the orchids. I told her that she deserved the best of everything and that the wedding should be as spectacular as possible. I wanted her to be happy, if only for a few more days, before I burned her world to the ground to save her from the man standing in the center of it. The 2 weeks leading up to the wedding felt like a slow-motion car crash that only I could see coming. I spent my days in a state of hyper-vigilance, playing the role of the quiet, uninspired daughter to perfection. Every time my mother called to complain about the seating chart or the cost of the artisanal honeycomb, for the gift bags, I listened with a vacant expression and offered nothing but soft, non-committal hums of agreement. My family had become so comfortable with the idea of my insignificance that I was practically invisible to them, which was exactly what I needed to be. I was the ghost in the machine, moving through their lives and gathering the final strands of Evan's web while they focused on the gold leaf trim of their invitations. I met Sarah for lunch at a trendy bistro in Lincoln Park a week before the big day. She looked exhausted, her skin pale against the backdrop of her expensive silk blouse. She spent 40 minutes talking about the logistics of the shuttle buses from the hotel to the vineyard, never once asking me how I was doing or if I had found work. When she finally paused to take a breath, she looked at me with a mixture of pity and irritation. She told me that she had talked to Evan about my situation and that he had generously offered to find me an entry-level position as a file clerk at one of his subsidiary offices after the honeymoon. He wanted to help me get my life on track. She said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that only comes from someone who thinks they've won a prize they haven't earned. I thanked her and told her that Evan was truly one of a kind. I wasn't lying. The rehearsal dinner was held on a Friday evening at the Vineyard in southwestern Michigan. The setting was undeniably beautiful, with rows of grapevines stretching toward the horizon under a sky painted in shades of violet and bruised orange. My parents had spared no expense renting out the entire estate for the weekend. As the guests arrived in their luxury SUVs and rented town cars, I watched Evan play the part of the triumphant king. He was wearing a light gray suit that probably cost more than my first car, his arm draped possessively around Sarah's waist. He was the center of every conversation, the bright sun around which my family's social world now orbited. I stood by the edge of the stone patio watching him charm a group of my father's old college friends. He was talking about a new green energy initiative in Northern California, tossing out numbers and names of venture capital firms with a practiced ease that made my skin crawl. He looked over at me and flashed that same arrogant smirk, the one that had started this entire countdown at the dinner table. He thought he had already secured his fortune. He thought that by marrying into this family, he was gaining a permanent shield of respectability. He had no idea that I had spent the previous night on a 3-hour conference call with Marcus and a lead investigator from the Illinois State Police Financial Crimes Unit. During the dinner, my father pulled me aside near the wine barrels. The scent of fermenting grapes and expensive tobacco hung heavy in the air. He looked at me with a strange, watery intensity in his eyes. He told me that he had made a final decision regarding my future. Since I clearly wasn't using my ambition to build a career, he had decided to take the remaining $65,000 from my untouched college fund and invest it into Evan's new offshore hedge fund. He said he was doing it for me so that I would have a safety net since I couldn't seem to provide one for myself. He actually patted my hand, believing he was being a visionary father, while he was handing over the last of his liquidity to a predator. I looked at his face, seeing the aging lines and the desperate need for his life to mean something prestigious, and for a split second, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered that he was only doing this because he valued Evan's lie more than my truth. I spent the later part of the evening in the barn that had been converted into a high-end reception hall. I found the audio-visual technician, a young man named Caleb, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He had been struggling with the projector all afternoon, and Evan had spent a good 10 minutes berating him in front of the catering staff for a minor cable issue. I approached Caleb when the room was empty and handed him a thumb drive. I told him it was a special surprise for the bride and groom, a tribute video that needed to be played immediately after the best man's toast. I also handed him $500 in cash and told him that no matter what happened, he was to keep the video running until the very last frame. He looked at the money, then at the thumb drive, and then back at me. He didn't ask any questions. He just nodded and tucked the drive into his pocket. I returned to the main patio just as Evan was finishing a story about a supposed meeting he'd had with a governor. My mother was laughing, her hand resting on his arm, looking younger than she had in years. They were all so happy in their delusion. I watched them and realized that this was the peak of the mountain. From here, there was nowhere to go but down. I checked my phone one last time. Marcus had sent a final confirmation. The woman from Ohio, the one who had lost her life savings to the man Evan used to be, had signed a sworn affidavit. The police were briefed on the location. The net was cast. I went back to my hotel room that night and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I didn't feel like a hero. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I had expected. I just felt a heavy, cold sense of duty. I thought about the next day, the white roses, the vows, the expensive champagne. I thought about the look that would be on Sarah's face when the music stopped. I knew that by tomorrow night I would be a pariah in my own family. My parents would never forgive me for the public humiliation even if I saved them from total financial ruin. They would hate me for the truth more than they hated Evan for the lie. I had to be okay with that. I had to accept that my role in this family wasn't to be loved. It was to be the one who survived. The morning of the wedding was eerily quiet. I woke up at 6 o'clock and went for a long walk through the vineyards. The dew was heavy on the leaves, and a low mist hung over the valley, obscuring the horizon. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who tried so hard to get an A on every paper, just to see my father smile, the one who spent her weekends helping Sarah with her homework, while Sarah went out with friends. I realized that girl had died a long time ago, buried under the weight of their constant disappointment. The woman walking through the vines now didn't need their smiles. She only needed the facts. By noon, the vineyard was a hive of activity. Florists were hauling in massive pillars of white orchids, the ones I had encouraged Sarah to buy with my father's stolen money. The caterers were setting out plates of lobster tail and prime rib. I saw Evan through a second-story window of the farmhouse, dressed in his tuxedo, drinking a glass of scotch with his groomsmen. He looked invincible. He looked like the man every father wants for his daughter, and every man wants to be. He caught my reflection in the glass and waved a gesture of supreme confidence. He still thought I was just the unemployed sister who had finally learned her place. I went to the bridal suite to check on Sarah. The room was a chaos of hairspray, champagne flutes, and expensive lace. Sarah was sitting in the center of it all, looking like a porcelain doll. She was beautiful, but there was a fragility to her that I had never noticed before. She looked at me, and for a second, the mask slipped. She asked me if I thought she was doing the right thing. It was the first honest question she had asked me in years. I had the chance right then to stop it. I could have told her everything in the quiet of that room, but I knew her. I knew that if I told her now, she would think I was sabotaging her because I couldn't stand the sight of her in a white dress. She wouldn't believe me until the evidence was projected on a 20-foot screen in front of 300 people. I told her that Evan was exactly the man she thought he was. It was the most honest thing I could say. She smiled, relieved, and went back to having her veil adjusted. I walked out of the room and down the stairs, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a drumbeat. I could hear the guests beginning to arrive, the sound of car doors slamming, and the light, airy chatter of the elite. I checked the silk-lined clutch in my hand, feeling the hard edges of the dossier I had prepared. I took my seat in the front row as the sun began its slow descent toward the hills. The light was golden and perfect, the kind of light that makes everything look like a dream. The string quartet began to play a soft, melodic piece by Bach. My mother took her seat next to me, her face glowing with pride. She didn't say a word to me, but she adjusted the lapel of my dress with a sharp corrective tug, a final reminder that even today I wasn't quite meeting her standards. I didn't mind. I just watched the altar. Evan walked out first, standing tall next to the minister. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze lingering on my father's wealthy associates. I could see him mentally calculating the wealth in the room, sizing up his next targets, before he had even finished with this one. He was a shark in a tuxedo, and the water was full of blood. When the music changed to the wedding march and the heavy doors of the farmhouse opened, every guest stood up in unison. Sarah appeared at the top of the aisle, clinging to my father's arm. They moved slowly, a vision of traditional American success. My father was beaming, his eyes fixed on Evan, as if he were looking at his own salvation. As they reached the altar, my father took Sarah's hand and placed it in Evan's. He whispered something to Evan, probably a promise to take care of his little girl, and then he stepped back to sit next to my mother. The ceremony began a long, poetic discourse on the nature of love and the endurance of truth. I watched Evan's face as he recited his vows, his voice steady and full of feigned emotion. He promised to honor her, to protect her, and to be faithful until death. I sat through the entire ceremony with a cold, focused stillness. I watched them exchange the rings. I watched them sign the marriage license on the small wooden table brought out by the clerk. I watched them walk back down the aisle as husband and wife, petals falling over them like snow. The crowd cheered, the bells of the estate rang out, and the air was filled with a sense of joyous completion. We moved toward the reception tent, the transition from the sacred ceremony to the opulent party seamless and polished. The tent was a cathedral of glass and light. The tables were set with gold-rimmed plates and crystal stemware that caught the fading sunlight. I sat at the head table with the rest of the family positioned just far enough to the side to be out of the primary photos, but close enough to see the sweat on Evan's brow as the evening grew warmer. The speeches started almost immediately. My father stood up first, tapping his glass with a silver spoon. He spoke for 10 minutes about the importance of family and the pride he felt in seeing his daughter marry a man of such character and vision. He even mentioned the investment fund, telling the room that he had never felt more confident in the future of the Miles legacy. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Evan stood up and hugged my father, a theatrical display of brotherhood that made my stomach turn. Then it was my turn. My father looked over at me, his expression softening into a look of cautious expectation. He had asked me to keep it brief and positive, clearly worried that I would say something to dampen the mood. I stood up and walked toward the podium, the microphone feeling cold in my hand. I looked out at the 300 faces, the wealth, the vanity, and the lies. I looked at Evan, who was leaning back in his chair with that familiar mocking smirk, confident that I was about to deliver a stuttering, awkward speech about how happy I was for them. I looked directly at Evan, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the small, quiet girl who was always in the way. I felt like the architect of a storm. I leaned into the microphone, the feedback echoing slightly through the glass walls of the tent. I told the room that my father was right about one thing. This was a day about legacy. But a legacy isn't built on what we want people to see. It's built on what is true when the lights go out. I looked over at Caleb the technician and gave him a single sharp nod. The giant projection screens behind the head table, which had been flickering with a soft focus image of white roses, suddenly went black. A second later, they were replaced by a crisp, high-definition image of a business registration document from the state of Delaware. The room went quiet, the kind of sudden heavy silence that makes your ears ring. I heard my mother gasp softly next to me. The screen shifted to a photograph I had taken myself, the strip mall mailbox in Indiana that served as the international headquarters for Apex Corps. Evan surged out of his chair, his face a distorted mask of rage and panic. He reached for the microphone, shouting that there was a technical glitch, that I was playing some kind of sick joke. But the video kept playing. The next slide showed a chronological list of bank transfers, clearly highlighting my father's $200,000 being moved into an offshore gambling portal within 48 hours of receipt. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The evidence was screaming. My sister Sarah looked at the screen, then at her husband, her face drained of all color. She looked like she was witnessing a murder. My father stood up, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he stared at the gambling logs. The guests were murmuring now, the sound rising like the tide phones coming out to record the collapse of the season's most perfect wedding. Evan tried to scramble toward Caleb at the back of the tent, but two men in plain suits stepped out from behind the floral arrangements and blocked his path. I stepped down from the podium and walked over to my father. I handed him the physical folder, the one I had carried like a shield. I told him that he didn't have to take my word for it anymore. I told him that the woman from Ohio, the one who had lost everything to this man, was waiting on the phone to speak with the authorities. I told him that I had spent the last 6 months being the failure he expected, so that I could be the daughter he actually needed. Evan was shouting now, a desperate cornered sound, as the officers led him toward the exit. He tried to tell Sarah he could explain that it was all a misunderstanding, but his voice broke when he saw the handcuffs. Sarah didn't follow him. She just sat there in her white silk dress, surrounded by thousands of dollars of orchids, looking at the empty chair where her dream used to be. My mother was weeping into a silk napkin, more upset about the scandal than the crime. My father looked at the dossier in his hands, then up at me. For the first time in 24 years, he didn't look through me. He looked at me. He tried to say something, perhaps an apology or a thank you, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't wait for them. I realized in that moment that I didn't need his validation to know I had done the right thing. I had saved his life's work, and I had saved my sister from a man who would have bled her dry, but I couldn't save the way they felt about me, and I was finally okay with that. I walked out of the tent past the 300 guests who were now whispering about the crazy sister. I didn't care. I walked toward the parking lot, the cool night air smelling of rain and grapes. I reached my car, tossed my heels into the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I drove down the long, winding path away from the vineyard, I saw the flashing lights of the police cars arriving at the gate. I didn't look back. I drove toward Chicago, toward my own life, leaving the white roses and the golden lies behind me in the dust. Walking away from that vineyard was the hardest and easiest thing I have ever done. Looking back on it now with the perspective that only time and a little gray hair can provide, I realize that we often spend our lives chasing the wrong kind of light. We want the spotlight, the flash of the camera, and the nod of approval from people who are too busy worrying about their own image to ever truly see us. We mistake wealth for worth and confidence for character, forgetting that a beautiful house can still be built on a foundation of rot. In this life, you will encounter many men like Evan Carter, men who speak in polished sentences and hide their hollow centers behind tailored suits. They count on your desire to be part of something successful to blind you to the truth. But more importantly, you will encounter families like mine. Families that would rather live in a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth. They will call you difficult, they will call you a failure, and they will try to make you feel small so that they can feel significant. Do not let them. There is a quiet power in being the one who observes. While the world is busy performing, you are gathering the facts. While they are shouting, you are listening. Integrity isn't something you can buy with a $200,000 check, and it certainly isn't something that requires an audience. It is what you do when the room is silent and no one is watching. I learned that my worth was never tied to my father's approval or my sister's happiness. My worth was tied to my ability to stand in the truth, even when it burned the world down around me. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the people you love is the truth they are trying so hard to avoid. You cannot carry the weight of their choices for them, but you can ensure they don't walk off a cliff in the dark. And once you have done your part, you must have the courage to walk away. You are not responsible for fixing a family that refuses to admit it is broken. You are only responsible for the person you see in the mirror. If this story resonated with you, I would be honored if you would subscribe to this channel and join our community. Your support allows me to keep sharing these reflections on the complexities of life and family. Please leave a comment below and tell me, do you think it is harder to speak the truth when it hurts or to live a lie that feels good? And if you found value in this journey, please give this video a like. I read every comment and truly appreciate you spending your time with me. Until next time, remember that the truth doesn't need a spotlight to be real. It just needs a witness.